The Soviet Union had thousands of spies. They had agents in governments, in military bases, in nuclear facilities. But of all of them, every single one, there was one man the KGB considered so valuable, so irreplaceable, that Moscow gave him a code name and protected it more carefully than almost any secret they had. That man wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was sitting at the very top of British intelligence, running the department responsible for catching people exactly like him. And for nearly 30 years, nobody had a clue. Picture the most elite university in England, Cambridge, early 1930s. The world outside is collapsing. The Great Depression has gutted the working class. Fascism is rising in Europe, and a generation of young, educated men are watching the global order crack apart in real time. Some of them drink through it. Some of them write poetry about it. And a handful of them, quietly, carefully, decide to do something about it. One of those men was born in 1912 in colonial India, the son of a powerful British diplomat. He was sent back to England for his education, first to one of London's most prestigious schools, then to Cambridge, where he studied history and economics. On paper, he was exactly what the British Empire liked to produce: polished, connected, destined for greatness. His name was Harold Adrian Russell Philby, though nobody ever called him that. From childhood, he was nicknamed Kim after the young spy in a Rudyard Kipling novel. It was, as it turned out, the most accurate nickname in the history of espionage. At Cambridge, something shifted in him. He looked at the world his family represented: colonial power, class privilege, an establishment built on keeping certain people at the top and everyone else invisible. And he decided it was rotten. He didn't just read Marx, he believed it, not as a phase, not as rebellion. He genuinely, deeply committed to the idea that the Soviet Union represented the future of humanity, and that everything standing in its way needed to be torn down. But here is where the story stops being about ideology and starts being about something far colder. In 1934, a Soviet intelligence officer operating under deep cover in Europe, a man recruiting idealistic young Westerners for Moscow, came across Philby's name. This recruiter was methodical, precise, and very good at identifying people who were not just sympathetic to communism, but genuinely useful. He saw in Philby something rare: a man with the right beliefs, the right background, and crucially, the right face. The kind of face the British establishment would never suspect. He made contact, and then he gave Philby an instruction that would define the next 30 years of his life. Cut off every communist friend you have. Stop attending any left-wing meetings. Stop talking about your beliefs entirely. And from this point forward, start behaving like the opposite of what you are. Attend pro-fascist events. Write sympathetically about right-wing movements. Build a reputation as a conservative, patriotic Englishman. Make yourself look like exactly the kind of person the British intelligence service would want to recruit. And Philby did it, without hesitation. He attended fascist rallies. He married a communist woman in Vienna for cover purposes, and then quietly distanced himself from her. He worked as a journalist in Spain during the Civil War, writing with a tone sympathetic to Franco's side, and got close enough to General Franco himself to receive a military medal. British intelligence noticed him. They liked what they saw. That was exactly the plan. By the time the Second World War started, Kim Philby was not just accepted into the British Secret Intelligence Service. He was being fast-tracked, promoted, praised, trusted. The man sent to destroy the British Empire from the inside had just walked through its front door, and nobody had the faintest idea. Getting inside MI6 was the hard part. What came next was almost embarrassingly easy. In those days, British intelligence ran on something that had nothing to do with skill, background checks, or security protocols. It ran on trust. Specifically, the kind of trust that only exists between men who went to the same schools, drank at the same clubs, and knew each other's fathers. If you were the right sort of person, and Kim Philby was absolutely the right sort of person, doors simply opened. No one looked too hard. No one asked uncomfortable questions. You were one of them, and that was enough. So Philby settled in, and almost immediately he got to work. Every morning he would arrive at the office like any other intelligence officer, polite, diligent, well-liked. He cultivated a reputation as someone who was good at his job, but also fun to be around. The kind of colleague people wanted at their dinner table. He made friends easily, laughed loudly, and drank with everyone. None of them noticed the other thing he was doing. Every evening, he walked out of the building carrying a briefcase full of classified files. Not just files related to his own work, files from across the archives pulled quietly throughout the day. He had befriended the archivist, which gave him access to documents that had nothing to do with his department. That night, his Soviet handler would photograph everything. And the next morning, Philby would arrive early, before anyone else, and return every single file exactly where it belonged. He did this for years. Now, the Soviets receiving this material back in Moscow were initially suspicious. The intelligence coming through was so detailed, so consistent, and came from such a high level that they genuinely wondered if it was a British setup, too good to be real. It wasn't. It was just that good. And then came the promotion that should never have happened. By 1944, the British government recognized they needed a dedicated unit to counter Soviet espionage, a department specifically designed to track, identify, and neutralize Soviet agents operating inside Britain and Western Europe. They needed someone sharp to run it, someone trusted, someone who understood the enemy. They gave the job to Kim Philby. The man now running Britain's entire anti-Soviet intelligence operation was reporting every detail of it directly to Soviet intelligence. So every agent being tracked, every operation being planned, every method being used to detect spies like him. He knew it all because stopping it was officially his job. Philby was not working alone either. The network he was part of, later known as the Cambridge Five, collectively passed close to 17,000 classified documents to the Soviet Union across 3 decades. The others included a senior Foreign Office diplomat, a man inside the wartime code-breaking operation, and a curator of the royal family's art collection, who was simultaneously feeding MI5 secrets to Moscow. Together, they represented the single most damaging intelligence breach the Western world had ever seen. What made it worse, what made it almost unbelievable, was the motivation. None of them were paid in any meaningful way. There were no secret bank accounts, no sudden wealth, no expensive habits that couldn't be explained. They did it because they believed. Every document handed over, every agent burned, every operation destroyed, all of it was ideological. They genuinely thought they were building a better world, which raises the question that the next chapter of this story answers in the most brutal way possible. What exactly does a better world cost when someone else is paying the price? Here is what betrayal actually looks like when you strip away the ideology and the justifications. It looks like a man reading a file about someone who's about to expose him, and then making a phone call. In the summer of 1945, a Soviet intelligence officer stationed in Istanbul walked into the British embassy with an offer. This man, a mid-level consular official, wanted to defect, and in exchange for safe passage out, he was offering something extraordinary: the real names of Soviet agents buried inside British intelligence. He was specific. He said there were 3 of them. 2 worked inside the Foreign Office. The third, he told the British, was the head of a counter-espionage organization in London. That third name was Kim Philby. The defector's file made its way through British channels and landed, or through a cruel twist of bureaucratic fate, directly on Philby's desk. He was asked to handle it personally. Think about that for a moment. The man the defector was about to expose was handed the file describing his own exposure and asked to manage the situation. Philby read it. He stayed calm. He immediately contacted his Soviet handlers. Then he deliberately stalled, manufacturing delays, slowing the paperwork, buying just enough time for Moscow to act. By the time he finally arrived in Istanbul to officially deal with the case, the defector had already been seized by Soviet agents, bundled onto a plane, and flown back to Moscow. He was never seen again. One open loop, quietly closed. One life, quietly erased. But that was a single man. What happened next was on a completely different scale. In 1949, Philby was posted to Washington as the top British intelligence liaison to the CIA, the most sensitive position he had ever held. He now had access not just to British secrets, but to American ones too. and one of the first major operations sitting on his desk was a joint CIA-MI6 plan to destabilize communist Albania by parachuting in trained anti-communist fighters. The operation had been carefully built over years. Recruits were gathered, trained, and organized into units. Drop zones were selected. Timing was planned down to the detail. Philby passed every single piece of it to Moscow. When those fighters landed in Albania, men who had left their families who believed they were fighting for their country's freedom. Soviet-backed forces were already positioned and waiting. Around 300 of them were captured or killed. Not because the plan was poorly designed, not because they were unlucky, because the man who helped plan it had already told the other side exactly where they would land and exactly when. In his own words, recorded years later, Philby said he had no regrets. They knew the risks, he said. He was serving a cause. The cause, by this point, had also extended into something far larger than Albania. During his time in Washington, Philby developed a close friendship with the CIA's head of counterintelligence. Long lunches, shared confidences, the easy intimacy of two men who trusted each other completely. Through that friendship, Philby extracted detailed information about America's nuclear weapons stockpile and, critically, how limited the United States' capacity actually was to produce new atomic bombs at that time. That intelligence reached Stalin, and historians now link it directly to two of the most consequential decisions of the early Cold War: the 1948 Berlin blockade and the arming of North Korea's military ahead of the Korean War. Thousands of lives, redirected by one man over lunch. The question was never whether he would eventually be caught. The question was why it took so long. The answer, it turns out, was hiding in plain sight for 25 years. In 1938, long before the Albanian disaster, long before Washington, long before any of it, a woman at a social gathering in London had a private conversation with Philby. He leaned in and told her directly that he was completely committed to the Soviet side, that he was carrying out something important, something secret. She understood exactly what he meant, and she said nothing. For 25 years, she kept that information locked away, while Philby continued climbing through the ranks of British intelligence, while hundreds of people died because of operations he compromised, while the Cold War reshaped the entire world. She finally mentioned it, almost casually, at a cocktail party in Tel Aviv in 1962. One conversation, 2.5 decades too late. That confession set off a chain of events that would end in one of the most chaotic, embarrassing moments in the entire history of British intelligence. By late 1962, MI6 finally had enough to act. But instead of arresting Philby, they made a decision that tells you everything about how this institution operated. They sent his closest friend, a fellow MI6 officer who had stood by Philby through every accusation, who had defended him in private and in public, who genuinely loved him like a brother, to confront him alone in Beirut, where Philby was working as a journalist. The two men sat together, and this officer, who had spent years insisting Philby was innocent, looked at his oldest friend and said, "I once looked up to you, Kim. My God, how I despise you now." Philby gave a partial confession, enough to confirm what MI6 already knew. A second meeting was scheduled. He never showed up. On the night of January 23, 1963, Philby was supposed to attend a dinner party. He didn't arrive. His wife waited. His colleagues waited. Meanwhile, a Soviet cargo ship had left Beirut port that same morning in such a hurry that its own cargo was left scattered across the docks. Philby later confirmed he was on it. He surfaced in Moscow weeks later. Many people inside British intelligence quietly believe MI6 allowed him to go. That letting him slip away was cleaner than a public trial that would have exposed just how completely the establishment had failed. And for how long. What waited for Philby in Moscow, though, was not the hero's welcome he had imagined. The KGB received him not as a colonel, which is what he believed he had been promised, but simply as an agent. That he was placed under effective house arrest, his visitors screened and controlled. For the first 5 years, he had almost nothing to do. He descended into heavy drinking. He attempted ending his life. The Soviet Union he had given everything to protect treated him like a liability it wasn't quite sure what to do with. It took a decade before they trusted him enough to let him train new recruits. In 2020, declassified British government files confirmed what many had long suspected, that the establishment had run an active campaign to suppress the full truth of what Philby had done, specifically to protect itself from the scale of the embarrassment. Earlier in 1988, just months before he died, a journalist asked Philby one final question. Given everything, the deaths, the betrayals, the decades of deception, the people who trusted him and were destroyed for it, would he do it all again? He didn't hesitate. Absolutely, he said. And that perhaps is the most disturbing thing about Kim Philby. Not the secrets he stole, not the lives he ended, but the fact that when given the chance to reflect on all of it, he felt nothing but certainty.